So as you just heard, this webinar is being recorded, and I will talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but just wanted to make sure you are aware. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. Well, we are at noon, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started, and a few more people will join us as we go. But thank you very much for joining us, everyone. I know it's a busy time of year, especially with the legislative season getting started. But we appreciate your attendance. I think this is a great webinar, and the Virginia chapter of the American Planning Association is happy to collaborate with the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration in presenting the first in this Resiliency Webinar Series. I believe there will be 6 total, and today our presenters will be presenting Resilience in Practice, Resiliency 101. So as you can see, this has been certified for AICP credits, including 1 credit for sustainability and resilience, a mandatory credit, excuse me. So that's wonderful. I will introduce I will let our speakers introduce themselves, but thank you, JaLeesa, Tate, and TechKatie for joining us this afternoon and giving us your time. So just a couple of housekeeping items. I will be dropping some helpful links in the chat box momentarily, so keep your eyes peeled on that. That will include links to the YouTube channel where you can find this recording of the webinar in about a few days, and all of our past recorded webinars in the MAPC series. We really do encourage questions, but if you could please submit your questions through the Q&A box just to help us keep track of all inquiries, that would be very much appreciated, as opposed to the chat box. But if you have any other comments, or if there's a time in which there's a less formal time for engagement, feel free to use the chat box. You can also use the chat box to direct message me if you run into any logistical questions. And during the Q&A portion, you may also use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted if you would prefer to answer your question verbally or orally. But otherwise, the Q&A is the best place to be. But again, I will be placing some helpful links and the CM number in the chat momentarily. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and hand it over to our presenters. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for some final housekeeping items before we close out this afternoon.
All right, can everyone see my screen? Excellent. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. This is, as she said, part of the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration. It would be helpful if I could speak. Resiliency series. So this is part 1 of 6, and this one is going to focus on Resiliency 101, kind of setting the ground rules, not rules, but setting the basics and the tone to make sure we're all kind of on the same page when it comes to talking about how to prepare your communities for resilience planning. Just a little bit of background on the collaboration. It was formed in 2020, and it was a good thing to come out of the pandemic. And it is, as you can see with all the logos on your screen there, it involves multiple chapters of the APA throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, as well as WVU Law Clinic and Chesapeake Bay program, just to touch on some of them. And the goal is to provide free educational resources with webinars such as the one that you see here today. And so far they've led the way with 25 webinars, and that's been able to reach thousands of participants. So it's a really great milestone. And each webinar does include the opportunity for CM credits for those of you who need to maintain your AICP certification. So just want to provide a brief overview of the series. Today's, again, is Resilience in Practice, which is, again, basic Resiliency 101. And you can see the goal is to hold this series, the webinar, on every third Thursday. The third Thursday of every other month, starting with January. And so you can see there the schedule of upcoming events. It promises to be a great series, so I do hope you will continue to stay tuned for all the upcoming sessions. I am joined today, or rather, I like to say I am joining JaLeesa Tate, and I'm going to let her introduce herself. But for a bit of background for myself, I am with West Virginia University TAB program. So we are the technical assistance to Brownfield provider for EPA Region 3. So that includes Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia, Delaware, and DC. So that's why that kind of explains my involvement with the Mid-Atlantic collaboration with the overlap there. And so all the assistance that we provide is free to communities, and our goal is to be able to help communities navigate the brownfield redevelopment process. So, JaLeesa, take it away.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Katie. And thank you everyone for joining today. So my name is JaLeesa Tate. Currently right now, I work at Tetra Tech, which is a private firm, and I'm a senior community resilience professional here. And I focus a lot on resilience planning, climate vulnerability assessments, and hazard mitigation planning as well. And in addition to that, I do some grant work, mostly related to the FEMA hazard mitigation assistance programs, and a lot of work with infrastructure and integrating nature-based solutions into that as well too. And so what I'll do is we can proceed with going over the agenda, and then I believe we have one quick polling question that we want to get into before we get into our content today. So essentially today, this is again meant to serve as more of a one-on-one or an introduction to resilience. So we want to make sure we first develop a shared understanding of definitions today. So I'd like to just make sure that everyone knows that we're talking about like hazard mitigation and not climate mitigation before we get started too far. So we'll also give an overview of, what do we mean by resilience planning? Why should we plan? Who's in charge of the planning, or who should be involved in that planning? And then just get you started on exactly where to start in case you're not really sure like how to even begin to think about developing a resilience plan for your community. We've also gathered a bunch of different resources that we're really excited to share about. We've gathered federal resources that we think are really beneficial, as well as some that are very state specific as well. And of course, we want to make sure that we leave plenty of time to have questions and more discussions with you all as well. So with that, Jillian, will you put up the first polling question?
Yes, give me one moment.
Okay.
Alrighty, it should be up for attendees.
All right, perfect. So our first question here is, how familiar are you with resilience planning? So we'll give everybody about a minute to respond to that, and then look at the results. I was saying, Jillian, how are we looking on responses? Good.
Yep, about 85% in. So you should be able to see the results now.
Yep, perfect. All right, so we have around 17% that's not at all familiar. More than half of you, the majority, I would say about 3/4, are somewhat familiar, and then right around 14% are very familiar. So this is nice because I feel like we have a really good mix, and I think that this is definitely the type of group that we want, where we can kind of encourage a shared community here, where if you have resources, you're someone who's very familiar, you have resources that you think are beneficial, like share those in the chat, so people that are least least less familiar will be able to kind of know where those are as well. All right, so with that, we will go ahead and jump right into it. So you can go to the next slide, Katie. So the first thing that we wanted to do was just define a couple of terms that we feel are really important here. So the first one being resilience. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about resilience? We know that resilience can be defined in a million different ways, and it means something a little bit different to everyone. I've definitely been in environments where when we talk about resilience, people are very, very focused strictly on like energy resilience. But for the context for today, we are really interested in looking at like whole community resilience. So not just focusing on one individual sector. So the definition that we have here, it kind of points out that, you know, resilience is the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions. It focuses on making sure we can withstand impacts and that we're also able to recover rapidly. I think that's really important when we talk about resilience, is that we're looking at, okay, everything is in place so you can quickly bounce back from any impacts that you might endure. And then the second part of this definition is that it includes the ability to withstand and recover from deliberate attacks, accidents, and naturally occurring threats and incidents. So again, this one focuses on not only natural disasters, but also man-made disasters that we might experience as well. So then moving to our next definition, you'll see we've labeled this as part one because hazard mitigation can be defined in a multitude of ways as well. And I think the really important things to focus on when we talk about hazard mitigation is, number one, we're looking at long-term solutions. So no quick fixes, no like band-aids or anything like that, but a long-term solution to reduce risk. And a lot of times that risk is going to focus primarily on natural hazards. But again, it can include maybe some man-made hazards as well. So the definition that we have here is that mitigation is looked at as the capabilities necessary to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters, and that you know, mitigation by itself is used interchangeably with hazard mitigation, and we'll use them interchangeably throughout our discussion today as well. And Katie, we can go to the next slide. And so then now the second part of mitigation. So again, the thing that we want to make sure is that, you know, we're talking about natural hazards and climatic impacts and climate change today. But when we're talking about mitigation today, we're not talking about climate mitigation in terms of the reduction of greenhouse gases. So I do like to make sure that we kind of set that at the beginning of any discussions that we're having, just so that we're all on the same page and have a shared understanding. So now we're following up just again to kind of build out, what does mitigation actually mean? So again, sustainable action, so long-term, that's reducing or eliminating risk to people and property from future disasters. And with mitigation, we're really focused on breaking this disaster rebuild cycle, where we get impacted with the natural disaster and then we rebuild everything as is, and then we get impacted with a natural disaster and we continue into this cycle. And so I really feel like this, you know, ties directly into resilience, because resilience is all about shortening that recovery time and making sure that you have the ability to quickly recover. And so when we think about, you know, implementing this practice or these concepts of mitigation, of hazard mitigation, that's where we have that opportunity to actually put, you know, projects into place where we can start to actually shorten that recovery time in between disasters and disaster impacts. Right, next slide, Katie.
Okay, so we want to jump in now to the why. Why do you need to prepare a resiliency plan? Well, resiliency planning gives the opportunity to communities to be able to identify the hazards and vulnerabilities within their area and begin to take steps so that they can implement action and achieve a reduction in those risks and also increase the preparedness. And that is going to vary according to the area. Where I live, it's going to be a different type of preparation plan than where it is for where JaLeesa lives. And so it's important to recognize our vulnerabilities and understand how we can better prepare so that we can plan ahead, because hazards are in fact devastating. We all know this. And so the opportunity to be able to plan ahead does improve your time to recover from the disaster, and it can also reduce those costs associated with that. And just as she touched on earlier, we want to enable communities to be able to change that mindset so that you can start to incorporate that nature-based rather than just rebuilding exactly what you had. I say a lot in my line of work that it's really important to me that I look at the big picture, and I like to encourage others to look at the big picture as well. And so it's all about connecting the dots as well. And so when you have, I like to think that our planner community can help communities take a look at that big picture, step back, take a look, an evaluation of what you have in front of you to understand, again, where those weaknesses are. And so when it comes to plans, planners can help the communities take a look at those existing plans and see if your goals do align with hazard resilience. Communities have multiple plans, but it is certainly not the case that they all line up when it comes to actually preparing a resilience plan. So there are tools out there to be able to help communities take a look at those plans, understand where they are weak, where they're vulnerable, and also what are stressors for the community so that you can get those multiple plans to line up. Because it's not uncommon for an economic development plan to be in conflict with a small area plan or a downtown plan. And so certainly when it comes to resilience planning, you absolutely don't want those to be in conflict with one another. They should align, and taking steps forward for one plan should not harm the plan that you have in place for another area. So when it comes to resiliency planning, you should recognize that collaboration and coordination are both critical. So that means collaborating with the partners that you will be setting out to work with and coordinating with them. Again, it's about recognizing policies that are in place, or maybe policies and plans that actually will need to be implemented. Vulnerable populations must be included when planning. You absolutely need to recognize that vulnerable populations are unfortunately hardest hit, and therefore the least likely to be able to recover as well as other areas where your vulnerable population is not as great. And resiliency is not a plan. It does weave through each department of your local government. JaLeesa is going to talk about that more, but there's room for plenty of people at the table, and there should be plenty of people at the table. You should make sure that it is a good representation of your community, both professionally and as well as just residential and community stakeholders. And I also we like to say that plans must be inclusive, and planners can help make sure this happens. So I like to toot the horn of the planners that, again, if anyone can help make this happen, to make sure the plan is in the planning process is including everyone that needs to be there, planners can do so.
All right, perfect. So we get to this big question of who is responsible for resilience in your community? And there is no single answer to this question, because I think it's really important, like Katie was just saying, right? It is planners can make this happen. And that resiliency is weaved throughout your entire government structure, throughout your entire community. Truthfully, because I would say the public, those vulnerable populations that Katie talked about, they also will play a critical role. And so what we've done is try to now kind of map out like where these sectors fit in. So number one is that every sector plays a part. So regardless if you are, within like natural and cultural resources or something more environmental, you play just as much of a role as, does the Department of Transportation, or anyone who's over infrastructure, emergency management, communications people. So every Black body is really integral to this process. And we cannot just have it be on the shoulders of, the folks who are environmentally focused, because like I said, it's all about the ability to recover. And so that is going to include the economics, the transportation, and so on. So everybody plays a part in this. So hopefully you have like a baseline understanding of where you might fit in the grand scheme of things when we start talking about, resiliency planning, or like what your, role for your sector might be. So fortunately, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has come out with what they call community lifelines. So they look at community lifelines as, what are the essential services that a community needs during some type of disaster. And they've split those different community lifelines into 5 different categories. And so we like to say, if you need to know where to start or how you fit in, a good place to start is looking at, how you fit into these different 8 community lifelines. So Katie, we can go to the next slide. All right. And again, it's all about the interconnectedness of community assets. So how do, communications align with energy, or fuel and transportation? How does that align with housing, or food and water? All right. And Katie, next slide. All right, so basically, again, community lifelines, this is what enables continuous operation of critical businesses and government functions, and it's essential to human health, safety, and economic security. And I feel like with that definition, we can all, see how we fit into the overall structure of this. We can all see how the work and our organizations play a part in this. So again, when we look at community lifelines, the different categories that they have are going to be communications, energy to include power and fuel, food, hydration and shelter, hazardous materials, health and medical, safety and security, transportation, and then water systems as well too. And or I can't say this year because it's not 2023 anymore, but last year I'll say FEMA actually introduced the water systems as a new community lifeline. And I think that just really highlights a bit more how important wastewater are to make sure that a community is still functioning in times of a disaster. And so again, the way that FEMA kind of uses these is, you look at it and you say, what, so what, now what, and like, where is the gap? And I think that's something that really translates to resilience planning as well too, because we kind of take this approach of, okay, well, what are we vulnerable to in our community? And it's like, okay, well, what impacts might those vulnerabilities lead to? And then we think about, what are we going to do about that? And we also have to assess, what is our adaptive capacity? So what do we already have as like a tool in our toolbox to address it, our vulnerabilities, and then what's missing? Like, what do we still need? So I think this is a really good concept. Again, kind of like if you are figuring out either for yourself, how you fit into resiliency planning, or you're kind of leading this initiative for your community and you're trying to figure out how to bring in your other departments and organizations. I feel like this concept is one that's really rooted again in resilience and making sure that communities recover quickly. And it's something that kind of lays the foundation for you to start. And next slide, Katie. All right, and then I'll turn it over to Katie to get us started with, where do you actually begin when you start kicking off or thinking about a resiliency planning process?
Thanks, JaLeesa. Kind of springboarding off what she was touching on with the community lifelines, I think that's a good opportunity to start to think about who should be on your team. So you want to start to put together the team that needs to help you evaluate what you already have in place and start to think about what you need to prepare for moving forward. And you want to build partnerships because you can't do it alone, and you need to start to establish good working relationships because you are certainly stronger together. Again, just like the hazards are different for each area, so will your team be. So some examples of who may be on your team is certainly going to include local government, the administration of that government. Is that a city manager? Is it a county administrator, planner? Because that's why we're here, right? FEMA, you certainly want to incorporate a representative there and all the great resources that JaLeesa is going to tell us about. Your local emergency management for your city or your county, you want to make sure they are brought into this preparation. Your local health department and your public health experts. So recognizing the difference between those two. Some nonprofits, those could be some that come into the area, especially if you are along a body of water, maybe an ocean. You may find again that a nonprofit may be someone who's there representing the interest there. Your state environmental agency, they certainly have some plans that are already in place, and they certainly want to be able to help mitigate any future disasters. Conservation or environmental protection organizations, that would be separate from your state environmental agency. Utility providers, again, going back to the community lifelines, recognizing the importance of water and sewer, and how that can certainly come to a halt if you have an emergency, and how would you be able to move forward. So you want them to be at the table. Academic institutions, they provide a lot of resources within communities, and that can be a local community college or a university, but they have resources that you may be able to tap into, and also your Department of Transportation. When it comes to, building that team, you want, and actually you need to establish trust with the team and the community. So when it comes to both the team and the community, your efforts need to be genuine. I know I've worked as a planner in communities before, and I haven't been a resident in that community. And sometimes just being the staff planner and then working on a plan there in that area, sometimes, you know, I feel like there's a question of, am I in it, you know, for the right reasons? Do I really have their best interest at heart? And we do, right? So we want to make sure that we recognize this and convey that we really do want to see their community be better prepared for any such disasters, so that it can be, hopefully the harm can be reduced, but also recovery time can also be reduced should the disaster happen. You want to collaborate with your community, the partners, and the stakeholders. Work to earn the trust. Sorry. Certainly sometimes government or your environmental agencies don't always have the easiest connection into the community, and you want to let them know that they absolutely are. Those are some of the greatest people that we work with on our team, and you know, you really do need to highlight that they are in it to help the community and really demonstrate that. So we want to collaborate and make sure that everyone is on the same page. Sorry. Be honest about the importance of taking action. Why is this important? Disasters are already happening with increased intensity in storms and more frequent flooding. So let them know that's going to continue to happen and most likely increase. When it comes to the community, be inclusive. So you want to consider their best outreach options. If you are working with a community with older residents, you may not be going the social media route as heavily. You may still find that you can rely on community bulletin boards. Those are still a great example, as well as the newspaper. Provide translation when needed. So always tap into resources. I'm really sorry. One more slide. So make sure you have resources available for those who don't speak English. Oh my gosh. and go where they are. JaLeesa?
Yep, perfect. Thanks, Katie. Okay, and we can go to the next slide here. All right. So getting into a little bit more of like explaining this concept and starting to build that buy-in with your community. And this is really my favorite part, because ultimately we're developing these resilience plans, for the betterment of our community and the people that live within those communities. So building off of all the topics that Katie just went over as well too, communication is going to be so important, and not just in terms of making sure that you're communicating throughout the development of your planning process, but it's the way in which we communicate with the community as well too. So don't use a lot of jargon, definitely plain language, and just explaining things to people in terms that they understand. I always say, and it's also really important to not, I kind of take the stance of not telling people things that they already know. So the example I use is I did a project in North Carolina recently, and I just said, I'm not here to tell people that they're vulnerable to hurricanes. They already know that, unfortunately. But I'm there to tell them, what could more severe impacts look like as we deal with the change in climate and different things like that. So I think it's really kind of understanding where people's kind of like foundational knowledge might begin and how can you add to that. And another thing is that everybody, unfortunately, is likely to be able to relate to natural disasters, but people might not buy into climate change as much. So, I know we want to go out and talk to people about sea level rise and different things, but we might lose some people in our audience. And so, it could be, you could be much more successful speaking about a recent flooding event or something like that that has happened in that community. The other thing is focus on why these impacts actually matter to people, right? So as practitioners, we understand what the consequences of all of this might be. But for an individual community member or a certain sector of community members, I feel like it's really important to connect to them to understand, why they should be listening, why they should be participating in this planning process. And I really like to use the example of the ag industry. So you'll have farmers who might have conversations with you and tell you that their growing season has been shortened because it's way too hot in the areas that they currently are right now to grow the crops that they're normally used to growing. Or it could be, that the fields stay way too wet right now due to, increased precipitation and different things like that. So I say really try and figure out what is that connection with people to make them understand why this matters to them. And then the last thing is to focus on the future. I know sometimes it can seem very heavy to talk about, climate change and the way that everything is going right now, but try and figure out, a way to approach that in terms of looking at what are the opportunities that are there. So that is a lot of times what I will try and focus on. And again, it's a little different because I'm very rooted in hazard mitigation. And so looking at ways to improve things and increase the level of protection that we have. But I do think it's really important that, yes, we want people to fully understand, what impacts are going to look like in the future, but we also want to take that as an opportunity to say, okay, well, like what are the things that we can do to build our community resilience and make our community stronger? And so I kind of feel like, again, those three kind of key topics. So how you're communicating, how are you connecting this topic to people's everyday lives? And then how are you basically setting up what the future will look like is really important in terms of starting to connect to the community. And next slide, Katie. All right. So again, just in terms of being relatable. So I think this is a really big part of it because always say that I really like to marry like the scientific data with local knowledge and lived experiences, because we have really great scientific data, but sometimes we fail at effectively communicating that to people. And I think once we start to bring people's lived experiences into the equation, that's where we start to make all of this information a lot more relatable. And again, finding that common ground of like, why does this matter to this community member? So think about like, what are the natural threats in the target area? So is it flooding? Is it wildfires? Is it drought? So think about the things that have been impacting your community. Think about how to convey the importance of taking action. So what are the consequences of inaction, right? Like, will things get worse? How will they start to feel those impacts more and more throughout, their everyday lives? And then the second one is climate change versus increased occurrences. So there's going to be like different terminology that's used. And again, I think it's important to understand like culturally what is going to be something that brings people in your communities versus things that might shut people out from those conversations. And again, climate change still continues to be a word that has a lot of tension around it. And I still deal with this in, all of my work. And so we have to figure out each project that I start, like what is the most appropriate way to engage people in this conversation so that they don't feel excluded or so that they don't automatically write this process off. And next slide, Katie. All right. And so again, I talked a lot about how do we connect this to every day. And so like when I first started this, we always talked about climate change in these planning horizons of like 2025 and 2050 and 2100. And so now we're only a year out from 2025. And I always say that climate change isn't necessarily something that's happening in our future now. We're living with a lot of those impacts daily. We just had, this summer, like the hottest temperatures ever recorded on Earth. And now we're seeing like hard freezes in the deep South this past week. I have family that lives in Alabama, and it was actually colder in Alabama yesterday than it was in Maryland. So we are seeing a lot of really interesting things, if you want to term them interesting, that's happening with our climate. And so I think that these are some of the points where you start to make it more relatable to people, especially in taking it outside of this term of like climate change. Right. So we know that there is increased storm frequency and intensity. So start asking people, like, they might say, oh, well, I've lived here for 20 years and I've never experienced storms this bad, different things like that. I live in a neighborhood now where every single time we have a thunderstorm, there are lots of downed trees in our neighborhood. And I just always say that is not normal. That should not be happening. Every single time we get a storm, but also things like regular street flooding where it just starts to become the norm. And so people stop realizing that, this is increased flooding that they are seeing. And then more frequent droughts or droughts that are more intense. Again, this summer with the increased temperatures, those were things that people, very clearly could be like, oh, I've never experienced heat like this, or we've never experienced, high temperatures for this long. And then the other thing is reduced air qualities. I think for a lot of us on the East Coast, we've never really had to deal with air quality impacts the way that we did this summer with the Canadian wildfires. And it was almost like the two coasts kind of flip-flop, because then there were hurricanes in the city of LA. And so again, I think those are the types of events that make people kind of perk up and start to pay attention a little bit more. And I think that these are the events that we can start to point back to so that we can show people, yes, like the climate is changing, whether we term that climate change or not. I think that they'll recognize that there is something different that is now happening. All right, and next slide, Katie. All right. So then we get into, we've talked about, how to communicate with people and how to make this information relevant to people. So I want to touch on the importance of making sure that we're including everyone, so across the whole community in this process as well too. So Katie spoke earlier about the inequities that are inherent in the disaster impacts. And that is, we could do an entirely different 1-week series on how those inequities, have come about. A lot of times, it could be due to historic disinvestment in a particular area of a city. It can be to, pronounced social vulnerabilities within individuals that live in communities and different things like that. And we know about frontline communities, right? So communities that have higher social vulnerabilities that also seem to be, I'll say they're more pronounced and put in harm's way where they are. So we want to think about who's being impacted and who's vulnerable to the impacts of these natural disasters. And so this is why community engagement is so important. I really feel like we always have to plan with a community versus planning for a community, so that we can ensure that the needs and the concerns of those community members are actually met, and they're uplifted through that process, and that, community members are not only engaged in the process, but they're actually empowered in the decision making as well too. So when we start talking about, okay, well, we know what the vulnerabilities and the risk, are now, and what are we going to do about it? What types of projects do we want to put forth? I think those are really great opportunities to bring in community members and kind of see what is the community actually interested in and what's going to have the greatest benefit for the community as well. All right, next slide, Katie. All right, so specifically a little bit more on vulnerable populations. I think a key pillar to resiliency planning is where we take this step back. A lot of times I feel like traditionally in a planning process, we focus on making sure that there are no adverse impacts. And we focus a little less on making sure that there are actual equitable benefits and outcomes. And I feel like a key point of resiliency planning is that you truly have to take that opportunity to look at, okay, what are the actual equitable outcomes and how do we measure those outcomes to make sure we're actually achieving them as well too. Because again, resiliency planning is all about the ability to quickly recover. And so as a community, you are, it's looking at the ability of the entire community to recover. So if we know that our vulnerable populations are going to, take more time to recover, we need to make sure that we are, putting more things in place to aid them in recovery and reduce the impacts to them directly as well too. And so we talk about vulnerable populations, especially social vulnerability. It could be like, individuals who are economically disadvantaged, minority and marginalized communities. So communities that also are just historically underserved or underrepresented, communities that have, an unequal exposure to pollutants. And it also gets into other socioeconomic factors as well too. Access to transportation plays a large part, because if you cannot get access to a vehicle to evacuate from an area and you have to stay there and hunker down, what does that mean now? Even access to broadband and internet to kind of know, okay, there is a hurricane coming, or whatever the case may be, to give you time to prepare or to increase your understanding about the risk that you face in your community. So that access to information can also be a barrier when it comes to looking at community resiliency. And next slide, Katie. All right. And so now we get into kind of like the actual planning process, right? So we've talked a lot about forming a really strong team and essentially kind of getting your engagement strategy in place. So thinking through that. So the next part here is assessing what you already have, what is there in your community already, and looking at what are the vulnerabilities within your community. So first we kind of say, gather up all your plans. I'm sure there's a lot of great work that's already been completed in your communities. And so I always like to do this because for me, it's really important that resiliency planning serves to complement existing work and not duplicate it. I think sometimes, there's a lot of great things or projects, ideas that are listed in plans throughout a community, and a resiliency plan can really serve to kind of bring those all to the forefront and really serve as the catalyst to hopefully get those implemented as well too. All right, and then the next step here is analyzing and assessing those plans. So again, comparing those, looking for, okay, where are the commonalities? Where do these things differ? So that it kind of guides you on a pathway of where you need to start with the resilience plan as well too. Right. The third one is understanding your vulnerabilities. And so it's not only looking at, okay, what, hazards impact the community, but I also say this is where you have to evaluate those non-climate stressors as well too. So things like if you have aging infrastructure, that reduces your adaptive capacity for being able to handle, flooding and different things like that. Because your infrastructure is more likely to fail. It's also kind of looking at, okay, does the majority of your population live within a floodplain? Are the majority of your, structures and your economic drivers located in these hazardous areas? So again, not only about, what impacts you, but also how you're impacted. Right. And then the last thing here is developing the plans. So this is where you want to be strategic about looking at, how do you start to address those vulnerabilities? And essentially it's developing your community's roadmap or your strategy for the steps that you want to take to start reducing your vulnerabilities and increasing your overall community resilience as well. So throughout the presentation, especially at this point, you'll start seeing we're adding in more links and information because we really want this presentation to serve as a resource for you. So the first thing we have here is the plan integration for Resilience Scorecard. So we feel like that's a really good resource to start helping you figure out how to address challenges and to understand and discuss inconsistencies that you might see throughout your network of plans in your community. Next, Katie. All right. And so again, I think up against community engagement, identifying the adaptation strategies might be my second favorite thing. So this is the fun part for me. This is kind of where the quote unquote rubber hits the road, is figuring out, okay, now that we know where the challenges are, exactly what are we going to do about it? So again, like I just said, this is building that roadmap. So these are kind of my best practices, if you will, for identifying adaptation strategies. So again, the first thing being ensuring that the community is part of that decision-making process. I think that's so important, not only so that you're planning with the community, right, and including them, but also because when we start to look at adaptation measures, a lot of them can be quite lengthy. It's not going to be most of the time something that you implement for 6 months or a year, and then you're done. Always say you are kind of in it for the long haul. So I feel like it's really important to find out who is the local champion in your community. Now, whether that is a employee of the community, a government official, or an actual community leader, is looking at who's going to really carry these projects forward and make sure they get across the finish line. The second thing here is prioritizing multi-beneficial projects. So this connects really well to what Katie was saying when we first kicked off the presentation about building that multidisciplinary team. So I feel like it's really important to have all those different perspectives, all those different subject matter experts in the room, because then you don't get these one-size-fits-all solutions, but you get things that are really unique to the community and things that really can address multiple concerns and priorities of the community at once. So again, we want projects that are multidisciplinary, and a lot of times that means including nature-based solutions as well too. And I see nature-based solutions kind of as a no-brainer for resiliency planning, because at the same time, we can start to hopefully address some of those drivers of climate change as we're trying to like prep for those impacts at the same time. Right. And the third one here is setting the stage for phased projects. Again, I am rooted in hazard mitigation, so I feel like it's okay for me to say this. I think sometimes in hazard mitigation, we get hyper focused on identifying a construction project. So it's what can we do right now to like immediately reduce the impacts. And I feel like the difference with resiliency planning is that we are a bit more intentional and we leave more room for planning and designing before we get to implementation. And so the example I like to use, and this kind of relates to a question Jason submitted earlier, and I'll give a fuller answer later, is if you take a community where it's an area that we need to have a discussion about retreat, right? Relocation. A lot of times in hazard mitigation planning, we'll say, okay, we need to do an acquisition demolition project here. And so when the next disaster hits, we'll get a grant, we'll offer, you know, people fair market value for their homes. They'll relocate, and then, you know, these homes will be demolished. I feel like with resiliency planning is, you know, okay, step one is let's do, you know, some more work with the community and build like a long-term strategy for how we can start to relocate people instead of waiting on the next storm, or, you know, if we have people who are very concerned and they're not willing to move, like what are alternatives to that? So I kind of see that when I talk about like phased projects, that is one way to look at it. And of course, with construction projects, you still need to do some additional planning and studies and different things. So I think with adaptation strategies, it's just looking at the full scope of like, what are all the steps that you actually need to implement this solution that you've come up with. Right. And then the next thing here is incorporating opportunities for capability building. I feel like this is critically important. A lot of times when working with you know, communities, whether it's local or state communities, we always run up against that they are strapped for, you know, capabilities and capacity. And I feel like when we focus on making sure we're incorporating capability building into our adaptation strategies, that really sets us up for continued success in our communities. So again, I spoke earlier about like these local champions, about who's going to get this across the finish line. I think that these go hand in hand for like making sure you maintain those capabilities to implement this project and get it across the finish line as well. And then the last thing is making sure that you have diverse funding streams. And this ties back to making sure that you have projects that are multi-beneficial and that, you know, speak to various grantors. So, you know, it's not only about developing an infrastructure project to fit within a FEMA program, but are there opportunities to integrate nature-based solutions into this, you know, project? And then you can apply for some, you know, maybe there's a local nonprofit that has grants available too. Because a lot of times when we're looking at grant programs, they'll have a match. In the case of like the federal programs for FEMA, for instance, you can use any type of non-federal match. So you could go and get additional non-governmental resources or even state or local resources to serve as a match for that as well too. So you definitely have to, I kind of say, be on the lookout out of how to best like leverage your different funding options. All right, so in terms of the different funding streams that are out there, So there are a lot, and I really like to focus on this just a little bit, because a lot of times, I'll meet people that say, well, funding is a challenge. And I think navigating the funding landscape is the challenge. I do think that there are a lot of different resources out there. There's a lot of money that's available. I do think that the challenge is actually figuring out how to leverage those different resources together. And I can't be on here and not speak to the complexity of the applications and everything themselves as well too. But what I wanted to do here was just look at the diversity of just federal funding. So I didn't go into state or local or any non-governmental resources. This is purely federal. And so again, it's not only FEMA, it's not only NOAA, but there's opportunities, available through housing and urban development, through Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, and so on. So just a few programs that I wanted to highlight here. Number one being FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant, which is BRIC. So BRIC is aimed at reducing the risk from natural hazards, and they also prioritize the integration of nature-based solutions, and then also climate change as well too. And so they fund a lot of activities for capacity and capability building, planning, design and engineering, and then actual project implementation. And then next up, we have HUD's Community Development Block Grant Mitigation, so CDBG MIT. So this is another one that's going to provide resources to mitigate against disaster risk, but it also prioritizes planning as well too. And so this is to look at, different planning activities that includes like regional level mitigation planning, and then also implementing some of those projects related to FEMA's mitigation programs. And the last one here is DOT's Thriving Communities program. So again, even though it's primarily focused on transportation projects, it's really looking at transportation projects that supports community-driven economic development, like projects related to health, environmental uplift, mobility, and access as well too. And so like that program is going to fund technical assistance, planning, capacity building, and these are the things that they're looking for basically to make sure they support disadvantaged and under-resourced communities. Okay, and next one, Katie. All right, so again, we'll start to get into more of our resources here. And so again, there is a lot of them out there. So we just kind of wanted to give you a sample of what's out there to kind of get you started and get you on the right track. So the first thing again is that FEMA Community Lifelines Toolkit that we talked about earlier. The second one is the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard. So I spoke briefly about that one as well too. So we think that that's a really good tool. The third one is the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, and it's a step-by-step guide for how to develop a resilience plan. So they break it down into, I think it's 5 nice and easy steps as far as like, this is the first kind of task you need to complete, the second one, and so on. And you really can use that as like, these are the overarching main components of the plan. And they even have a practitioner's guide that really walks you through everything. And then in terms of figuring out where is the data to inform your plan. So if you don't have resources to go out and, develop additional data or something like that. So FEMA has a resilience analysis and planning tool, or RAP. So that is one where you can go and pull down additional like climate related data. They have some resiliency information on there as well. And then FEMA has another tool that's called the National Risk Index, or NRI. And that tool, it is going to integrate community resilience, vulnerability, and like vulnerability to hazards as well too. So those are our kind of like first set of resources there. And next slide, Katie. All right, and then the last one, and these were like our more like high level resources. The last one is one from the Chesapeake Bay program. So they actually held a local government forum last year that was dedicated towards working with local government officials, so elected officials mostly, but identifying like what are those challenges and roadblocks at the local level to integrating resiliency into other plans or just building a standalone resiliency plan. And so they came up with like where some of those pain points might be, some potential ways to overcome those roadblocks, and then some additional recommendations too. So I think that one is a really great resource because it really speaks to what the local challenges might be. And next slide. All right, and so now getting into some of the resources by states. And again, there are a lot of good ones out there, and I've even seen people putting some more stuff in the chat as well too. So thank you, because that's exactly what we want to happen. We only have a small selection here, and we know that there are so many more out there. So definitely share with others that are on the call today. So first off, we have in Delaware, RASCL, so that's the Resilient Sustainable Communities League. They have a really nice grants database that you can search for potential resources to fund planning projects or to fund like the implementation of your plan. The next one is Maryland. And again, I am biased. I am from Maryland. I worked a lot in Maryland, so I know that there are so many more. So all my Maryland people who are on the call, please put those in the chat. But the first thing is the Maryland Resiliency Partnership. So that's a partnership of multiple government and non-governmental agencies that meet regularly to identify opportunities throughout the state to provide assistance to local communities. And they also have a database on their website of different grant programs that, you know, communities can use as well. And then the second thing is the CoSmart Communities program that's run out of the Department of Natural Resources. And then for North Carolina, we have the North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan. So I think that's a really great one to look at, especially I think if you have a state level plan, that's like a starting point to figure out how to develop this for your community. And then the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, they have an entire program devoted towards helping communities build their resilience. So they have the Resilient Communities Program. Pennsylvania, the Sea Grant has a program there, and then also Penn State has an initiative for resilient communities. Virginia, through their dam safety and floodplains, there's a program you can look at there. And then for West Virginia, they also have a state resiliency office. And next slide, Katie. Right, and I thought that this was a really helpful map because it gives you a really quick snapshot in terms of, you know, which states have Office of Resiliency, a state resiliency officer, or a commission or a task force. And then we have a link here as well too that'll link you directly to the websites for these organizations or individuals that are within your state. And I have to mention, I didn't include it here on the slide, but also you have to look at your state hazard mitigation officer. So each state is going to have a state hazard mitigation officer, and that's going to be the person who administers FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance grants, and will also be a really great resource to help you with like hazard mitigation planning that you can like integrate the principles of resiliency as well. All right, and next slide, Katie. All right, and over to you.
Thanks, JaLeesa, and thanks for bearing with me as I got my voice back. You did a wonderful job. Thank you so much. That was so informative. I hope everyone here on the call found that as helpful and as informative as I did. So we want to take this opportunity to ask any questions. You can pose them, type them in the box, or you can ask go through the channel to Ask Jillian. We'd be happy to answer those. And while you're still thinking of those, I just want to let you know that the next resiliency webinar within the series is going to be held on March 21st. It's at the same time, 12 o'clock. You can look for the Zoom link coming soon. Jillian may know a little bit more about that, but the topic of that one is building community resilience. So happy to answer any questions that you may have. And I just have to say, I see all the comments about Go Ravens, but I'm a Steelers fan, so I'm still a little bit sad. So.
Well, it looks like we do already have a few questions that have come in throughout the presentation. The first one being from Jason Dubois, and I apologize if I'm getting anybody's name incorrect. Jason asks, when can a community determine when mitigation is or will be no longer a workable, cost-effective approach, and how should instead pursue abandoning land and moving away?
And I can start, and Katie, feel free to jump in at any time. And I have to let the audience know I've worked a lot with Jason on this, and we've experienced this quite a bit in Maryland. And I feel like this one is a really hard one because number one, like even when we abandon the land and we move on, I still feel like that is a form of mitigation because we are reducing the risk to the people that were there. I think one of the ways to start determining it is, I hate to say like starting to, you know, look at, okay, what are the benefits versus the losses that they're continuing to experience there. So if you have an area that's repeatedly being flooded, so looking at, okay, what are the costs for us to, you know, rebuild every single time versus what would be the cost for like, you know, acquisition, demolition, and of course to support them to relocate. I think that is like a very quantitative way to look at it. I think qualitatively, there's a lot of other factors, things like people are really connected to their land. And so although, you know, we don't live there, right? Like in that particular house or on that piece of land. So it's easier for us to say, oh, okay, they've been flooded 3 times. Like, of course they should leave. For other people, that might be, you know, where their parents grew up, or that might have been their, you know, grandparents' home. And so they're still very connected to those memories and different things like that. And I think that's where we can start looking at other more innovative, creative ways to kind of help with, again, this long-term planning. So maybe it's that it might not happen in the lifetime of the current residents, but perhaps there is, you know, some estate planning that can happen so that, you know, house can pass on, you know, to the government if those people do not want to leave or something like that. So I don't feel like there's like a cut and dry answer for that one, except that I think in those circumstances, there's a lot of work that has to happen with the community members when we start to talk about relocating them. Yep, of course. Thank you, Jason.
Jason also has another question, and we do have time for all the questions that are in. So everyone, please submit your questions because we have until 1:30. So feel free to ask them. And if you happen to not think of anything until after the webinar, we'll be providing our presenters' contact information in our follow-up if you have any further questions. Jason's other question is, one challenge is when a community isn't yet experiencing a hazard, but we are forecasting those hazards in the future and therefore planning should begin for that hazard. What are some methods for discussing this with communities when this situation is the case?
Yeah, so I'll start with I think I'll say the coolest thing I've seen so far. So at one point, the Nature Conservancy was working with communities in Baltimore County, and they had like a virtual reality headset that they were taking out to community meetings. And in this virtual reality headset, you could actually see what like 1 foot or 2 feet or 3 feet of flooding would look like for like the community center that they were actually meeting in. So I know not everybody has resources to like develop a virtual reality kind of rendering. But I think that's the coolest thing I've seen in terms of discussing what those future impacts could look like if they're not experiencing that yet. Of course, modeling is a really good way to show that as well too. And I think when we model things, and again, we have a tendency to just lay it out on, a flat map and say, okay, this is where, the 100-year floodplain is going to be in 20 more years, and showing them their property. But I think, we should couple that with also showing them, for communities that are already experiencing those impacts, like what have those impacts looked like for them, and like what consequences have those impacts had in those particular communities. So I think as people, as humans, we're very visual. So I do feel like showing the pictures and different things like that are really important. Or even if there have been like some notable events that are starting to happen, but are like not happening on a consistent basis now, it's jogging people's memories back to, okay, this is what this could potentially look like every single day though. And so I've seen a good use of this, especially when it comes to extreme heat. Right, so all of us, when we get like, especially in the mid-Atlantic, we get in our like triple digits of heat, and we're just like, we can't live like this. We don't understand how people in Florida like survive this all the time. And it's putting it into reality that like, yeah, maybe now we experience this, only 5 times out of the year, but in 10 years, we could be experiencing this, 10 times out of the year or something like that. And I'm just pulling those numbers like out of thin air right now. But I think those are some of the ways that we can kind of like translate to people that no, you're not experiencing it right now, but this is what it could look like in the future for you. And Katie, please feel free to jump in at any point.
I think that's well said. I was only thinking about sometimes it sometimes it connects with communities to hear from cohorts or other communities who have gone through similar situations, and maybe we're not quite a believer, rather than feeling like they're being talked at, but talked to and being part of a conversation. And again, just trying to let them know that again, we're not trying to make them believe something that is very extreme, but just trying to make that connection of just what you're saying. A few hot days here is going to translate to more in the future, and that's going to continue to grow. So we just sometimes try to look for, if I'm not the best person to try to communicate something to a particular community, who in my collaborative team may be a good one to help us reach out and make that connection.
And we have a question from Elizabeth Nowak. Elizabeth says, it seems every time there are planning initiatives, you have to start at the beginning of gathering plans. Do you have any recommendations for how to best communicate, transparently track complementary resilience planning for internal staff and external partners?
I can start. I hate to say it, but I really feel like you have to designate like who in your community is actually going to hold responsibility for like resiliency. And this kind of taps into that second question as well too. And I say I hate to say it because I wouldn't want to put like additional responsibility on any local government staff, because I know everybody is already stretched so thin. But I think a lot of times, right, so like emergency management might be doing hazard mitigation planning. The actual planning department, community development might be doing, some of your resiliency planning. And then if you have an office of sustainability, perhaps they're the ones that are, doing a different type of plan, but that these 3 plans still kind of all go together. I think it's really kind of looking at, okay, who is going to be the one agency that has oversight over all of these. And then I'm really big on like using technology to track everything as well too. I think a lot of times we track all of our, strategies and actions and different things. We track them separately. And a lot of times there's a lot of overlap in these actions and different things. And so I think more importantly, even if you don't like go back through the entire plan as a starting point, but starting to look and see, okay, what actions and strategies and projects were identified that overlap, or they're, have a lot of, they're very similar, and maybe they can be retooled so that they're streamlined a bit more. So that way it just doesn't seem so overwhelming that there's like so much work to be done, because a lot of times there are opportunities to like streamline that a bit more. But definitely I think finding a good way or a good tool to track it is really important. And Katie, do you have?
I would just like to say I have not yet had the opportunity to use this scorecard that's referenced here on this resources page, but I've dived into a little bit. It was done in collaboration with the APA. So it's and there's a training that you can take through the APA website to give you familiarity with the process of going through that scorecard. So it is a time commitment, but it does help guide you through the process of trying to pull out those plans and look at the policies that the various plans have in place, so that you can see just what they discuss, how strong is that, is it weak, is it non-existent. So it at least does kind of lay out a groundwork so that you may not feel like you're starting from scratch, even though, like I say, you kind of need to get up to speed on that process, but that is a tool that's available. And just as JaLeesa was saying, with find that person, and it may be people. So when you live and work in a county, a lot of times those jurisdictions are going to want they're going to want to maintain their involvement. So if there's a regional planning authority or something like that where they are already at the table, how can you get to the table and convey to them that this is something you all need to be working on? I know it can be frustrating as a planner when you talk to a city planner and you talk to the county planner and you have the same vision as the staff person, but how can you ensure that when it comes to something like a resiliency plan, you can get those decision makers to be on that same page, to kind of go where they are, which when I was dying earlier, my coffee fit was what I was trying to say, is go meet them, go where they are, the people in the community. If there's an existing community meeting, go there. But in this situation, if there's a county commission meeting and they meet and bring in some other jurisdictions, go to that meeting and see if maybe you can have a conversation with them to start that. You're right. It is. I agree with JaLeesa. It is a long process, and it's a marathon, not a sprint. And so patience is a virtue for all of us. I tell myself.
Thank you. So the next question we have is from Michelle Zuninga, and I'm again sorry for the pronunciation if it's not accurate. Are there resources or plans highlighting weatherization projects that can be made to the home to meet climate adaptation? For example, is there a scorecard to assess what changes should be made to older homes to make sure residents are not impacted by severe cold weather or heat? And her follow-up question, which I think is interesting one to pose, also, how do we know when a community has reached climate resilience?
Yeah. So I'll start, Katie. I think it's a really excellent question. In terms of weatherization projects, I'm not like intimately familiar of like what the guidance is that's out there. I know even in kind of preparation for this webinar, I came across at least grant resources from like DOE, and then I know specifically in Maryland, the Maryland Energy Administration, MEA, I believe they have like particular grants as well too. And there was actually, I believe there is an organization, I want to say the name is Passive House. I'm going to look it up really quick to make sure that that is correct when Katie starts answering. But I believe the organization is called Passive House. And they kind of have this concept of making sure that your house is completely sealed to help with, energy and different things like that, but weatherization overall. So the short answer is I'm not familiar with the resources that are out there, but I'm sure that there are like a great deal of those resources. I also live in a much older home. I live in Baltimore City, so everything here was built like 100 or more years ago. So probably things I should personally know about. So I'll look really quick about the passive house. And then the second question here about how do we know when a community has reached climate resilience? I think that's a really interesting one. So there's the New Jersey Institute of Technology. They have actually developed like a tool to look at some quantitative measures to determine resilience. However, I think it's great. I love their tool. I really think it's more qualitative, right? I think you really start looking at like how is your community able to respond and bounce back from some of these hazard impacts over time now. But I don't think that, we can like there's a checklist for resilience, I'll say, which is really hard to kind of, say go out and do hazard or go out and do resiliency planning, but not really knowing if you're like meeting the mark, so to speak, in terms of like building community resilience or climate resilience. So that would be my response to that part. And Katie, I'll pass it over to you while I look up passive house.
I honestly am not familiar with this. I know that we internally here in West Virginia and Virginia, we have bad building programs, but that's honestly trying to get a community to recognize abandoned and dilapidated, mostly residential homes within a community. But and then we try to work with communities to identify some resources, but really haven't had to ask that question yet. So I apologize for that, but I hope that what JaLeesa offered up was helpful, was for me anyway.
Alrighty, well, while we wait for any other questions to come in, should we go ahead and launch that second poll question?
Sure. Thank you.
Well,
I would just
go ahead, Katie.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it looks like people were able to take away a lot from this webinar. And for those of you that indicated, you're still not super familiar with the subject, I know our presenters are open to being a resource, for further information and discussion.
Absolutely, yes. Our contact information is here. My team, the technical assistance, Brownfield provider, we always say if we don't know the answer, we work with you to try to connect you with someone who may know those answers. Now I know JaLeesa would be someone I would put you in touch with because she's been very informative. So we work closely with the EPA because we are the Brownfield technical assistance provider for them. So I know that they do have some resources when it comes to resiliency and trying to address climate change. So that's become an area of focus of late. So you may want to look to that for a resource that could help give you kind of a jump start too, as another resource when she was talking about looking at more diverse areas of funding.
Alrighty, well, if we don't have any other questions, I will just remind everyone that a follow-up email will be going out to all attendees, which will include, again, the contact information of our speakers, the link to the recording, which will be on the MAPC YouTube page, and a link to the presentation slide deck. along with other updates in the webinar series and other APA Virginia information. And I'll just do a quick plug that APA Virginia has officially opened up its RFP for session proposals for the 2024 conference in Williamsburg in July, which can also be found on our website page. But I really appreciate Katie and JaLeesa's time. I think it was an incredibly informative presentation, and I'm glad that we were able to answer so many questions. Do either of you have anything else that you'd like to add before we close out? Alrighty. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We appreciate your time this afternoon, and I hope everyone stays warm.